One of the biggest questions dominating global politics today is how the war between Russia and Ukraine will finally end. For more than 2 years, the conflict has reshaped the international order, divided alliances, weakened economies, triggered military buildups, and forced nearly every major power to rethink its long-term security strategy. From Washington to Brussels, from Moscow to Ankara, governments are now searching for a formula that can stop the war before it grows into something even larger and more dangerous. The conflict is no longer viewed as a regional war limited to Eastern Europe. It has become a global geopolitical struggle involving NATO, the European Union, the United States, Turkey, China, and many other actors with competing interests. Every diplomatic meeting now carries enormous weight because one agreement, one compromise, or one strategic shift could dramatically change the balance of power in Europe and the Black Sea region. Recently, attention turned towards Saudi Arabia after American and Russian delegations met in Russian negotiations. These talks immediately sparked worldwide speculation because they represented one of the most serious diplomatic engagements between Washington and Moscow since the war escalated. The atmosphere surrounding the meeting created cautious optimism among analysts who believe that both sides may finally be searching for an exit strategy. Senior diplomats from both countries described the discussions as highly significant and unusually constructive. Observers noted that the tone of the talks appeared very different from previous rounds of negotiations where accusations and rigid positions dominated the conversation. This time, there were signs that both sides were at least willing to explore possible compromises. The talks in Riyadh also reflected a major shift in American foreign policy under President Donald Trump, unlike the Biden administration's approach, which focused heavily on military assistance and economic pressure against Russia. Trump's administration has shown stronger interest in pursuing direct negotiations with Vladimir Putin. One of the most important statements came from Steve Witkoff, President Donald Trump's special envoy. According to Witkoff, the United States was closer than ever to reaching a peace agreement that could eventually bring the war to an end. His comments immediately attracted international attention because they suggested that actional diplomacy between Washington and Moscow had made more progress than previously understood. Witkoff emphasized that Putin appeared surprisingly flexible during recent discussions. He stated that the Russian president was showing signals that he genuinely wanted to make a deal. Those remarks were interpreted by many as an attempt to prepare the public for a possible compromise solution that might involve difficult concessions from all sides. The reference to the so-called Istanbul Protocol agreement was also extremely important. Earlier in the war, Turkey had hosted negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, and although those talks eventually collapsed, they produced a framework that some diplomats still believe could serve as the foundation for future peace efforts. Turkey's role in the conflict has therefore become increasingly significant. Unlike many Western countries, Ankara managed to maintain communication channels with both Kyiv and Moscow throughout the war. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan continued speaking directly with both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky, while also balancing Turkey's strategic interests inside NATO. As the second round of talks between the United States and Russia approached, the European Union was also preparing for the possibility of a negotiated settlement. European leaders understood that any ceasefire agreement would fundamentally reshape Europe's security architecture and determine the future balance of power on the continent. The EU therefore approved its 16th sanctions package against Russia in an attempt to maintain economic pressure while negotiations continued. European officials hoped that weakening Russia financially would eventually force Moscow into accepting a broader compromise. At the same time, the United Kingdom and France revived discussions about sending troops to Ukraine as part of a future peacekeeping mission. French President Emmanuel Macron had floated similar ideas before, but this time the proposal gained far more attention, because it was being discussed in the context of an actual ceasefire framework. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer also began openly supporting the possibility of a European-led peacekeeping force. The idea immediately triggered intense debate inside NATO because deploying troops to Ukraine, even under a peacekeeping mandate, carries enormous strategic risks. Some European governments worried that such a mission could eventually drag NATO into direct confrontation with Russia if the ceasefire collapsed. Others argued that without credible international guarantees, any peace agreement would simply allow Moscow to regroup and launch another offensive later. While Europe debated these risks, Turkey unexpectedly emerged as one of the most important players in the discussion. Ankara carefully followed the proposals coming from London and Paris, and then made a move that few expected. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that Turkey could potentially join a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine if the right conditions were met. The statement shocked many observers because it placed Turkey directly at the center of one of the most sensitive geopolitical discussions of the war. Erdogan made these remarks after separate meetings in Ankara with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The timing was extremely significant because it demonstrated Turkey's effort to maintain influence with both sides simultaneously. Turkey's possible involvement in a peacekeeping mission would dramatically change the strategic dynamics of the conflict. Unlike many European countries, Turkey possesses one of NATO's largest armies and controls the entrance to the Black Sea through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. This geographical position gives Ankara enormous leverage in any future security arrangement involving Ukraine and Russia. Turkey is not just another NATO member, it is the strongest military power on the Black Sea and one of the few countries capable of communicating effectively with both Moscow and Kyiv. The Turkish government quickly clarified that it would only consider deploying peacekeepers if the mission were part of a broader, internationally recognized agreement. Ankara made it clear that it would not act alone or enter Ukraine without clear diplomatic and legal guarantees. Nevertheless, the fact that Turkey even discussed such a possibility represented a major strategic shift. It showed that Ankara was prepared to move beyond mediation and potentially become an active security actor on the ground. Ukraine reacted positively to Erdogan's proposal. Ukrainian officials emphasized Turkey's consistent support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity since the beginning of the war. They also highlighted Ankara's role in providing military equipment, especially Bayraktar TB2 drones. During the early stages of the conflict, the United States also appeared supportive of the general idea. American officials indicated that any future peacekeeping force would likely depend heavily on European and regional allies rather than direct U.S. troop involvement. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested that such a mission should be led primarily by European and non-European partners, which immediately increased the importance of countries like Turkey. President Donald Trump further intensified speculation by claiming that he had already discussed the peacekeeping issue with Vladimir Putin. Trump suggested that the Kremlin leader might eventually accept the deployment of international forces under certain conditions. However, even if Putin were willing to tolerate such a mission, many analysts believe powerful factions inside the Kremlin would strongly oppose it. Russian hardliners have consistently warned against any NATO-linked military presence inside Ukraine. This is why Turkey's role becomes so unique. Although Turkey is a NATO member, Ankara also maintains deep economic and political ties with Moscow. Erdogan and Putin have built a complex personal relationship over many years, cooperating and competing simultaneously across multiple regions. Turkey purchases Russian energy, coordinates with Moscow and Syria, and avoids fully joining Western sanctions against Russia. At the same time, Turkey supports Ukraine militarily and strongly opposes Russian dominance in the Black Sea. This balancing strategy has allowed Ankara to maintain influence on both sides of the conflict. While many Western leaders lost direct access to Putin, Erdogan continued holding regular conversations with the Russian president. Turkey's diplomatic importance became visible very early in the war. In March 2022, Ankara hosted one of the first high-level meetings between Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers in Antalya. Although those talks failed to produce a breakthrough, they demonstrated Turkey's ability to bring both sides to the negotiating table. That diplomatic role later became even more important during the Black Sea grain agreement. The grain deal represented one of the few major diplomatic successes during the war, brokered by Turkey and the United Nations. The agreement allowed Ukrainian grain exports to continue through a protected corridor despite ongoing fighting. The significance of the grain initiative went far beyond Ukraine itself. Millions of people across Africa, the Middle East and Asia depended on those grain shipments. Without the agreement, global food shortages and price spikes could have become catastrophic. Turkey's role in securing the deal significantly increased Ankara's international prestige. It showed that Erdogan could use Turkey's unique position to achieve practical results, while many other diplomatic efforts remained stalled. Turkey also facilitated intelligence-level discussions between the United States and Russia regarding nuclear risks. Ankara later played an important role in several prisoner exchanges between Moscow and Kyiv. These diplomatic successes strengthened Turkey's image as a country capable of operating simultaneously within Western institutions and outside traditional Western frameworks. However, Turkey's position is not without complications. Many Western governments remain cautious about giving Ankara too much influence over Europe's security future. Some European officials distrust Erdogan's broader geopolitical ambitions and worry that Turkey could use the conflict to increase leverage over the European Union. At the same time, Russia also has reasons to be suspicious of Turkey. Moscow remembers clearly that Turkish drones played an important role in helping Ukraine resist Russian advances during the early phase of the war. Turkey also continues rejecting Russia's annexation of Crimea and insists that occupied Ukrainian territories remain part of Ukraine. These positions directly conflict with Moscow's strategic goals. This means Ankara constantly walks a geopolitical tightrope. Turkey is neither fully aligned with Russia nor fully trusted by the West. Instead, Erdogan has tried to position Turkey as an independent regional power capable of negotiating with everyone. That strategy reflects Turkey's broader worldview. Ankara increasingly sees the global order as multipolar rather than dominated solely by the West. In this system, regional powers like Turkey believe they can pursue independent foreign policies without completely choosing sides. This approach explains why Turkey continues cooperating with Russia economically while simultaneously supporting Ukraine militarily. Erdogan believes that maintaining ties with both sides maximizes Turkey's strategic influence. For the United States, Turkey's involvement could provide major advantages. Washington understands that Ankara possesses communication channels and regional leverage that many Western governments lack. Trump's administration appears particularly interested in using Erdogan's relationship with Putin to facilitate negotiations. Trump himself has repeatedly emphasized his confidence in personal diplomacy and leader-to-leader communication. At the same time, American strategists also recognize Turkey's military importance within NATO. Turkey possesses one of the alliance's largest standing armies and significant experience operating in complex regional conflicts. If a ceasefire agreement eventually emerges, Turkey could potentially help enforce stability in the Black Sea region while reducing the burden on other NATO members. Yet major challenges remain. One of the biggest questions concerns how Russia would react to Turkish troops operating inside Ukraine. Even if Putin publicly accepted a peacekeeping framework, nationalist factions within Russia could portray Turkish involvement as a dangerous expansion of NATO influence. The Kremlin would also likely demand strict limitations on any peacekeeping force, including restrictions on weapons systems, troop numbers, and operational zones. Meanwhile, Ukraine would insist that any peacekeeping mission provide genuine security guarantees rather than symbolic monitoring. Kyiv fears that a weak or poorly structured agreement could simply freeze the conflict temporarily while allowing Russia to rebuild military strength for future offensives. This is why many Ukrainian officials view Turkey as potentially valuable. Unlike some European countries, Ankara has demonstrated willingness to challenge Russian influence militarily when necessary. Turkey's military operations in Syria, Libya, and the South Caucasus showed that Ankara is prepared to use force to defend its strategic interests. At the same time, Erdogan's government has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to negotiate directly with Moscow even after military confrontations. This combination of military capability and diplomatic flexibility makes Turkey uniquely positioned compared to many other NATO states. European leaders are increasingly recognizing this reality. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte recently emphasized the importance of deeper cooperation with Turkey's defense industry. Turkey's growing drone production capabilities and expanding military-industrial base have attracted significant international attention in recent years. The Bayraktar drones used by Ukraine became symbols of resistance during the early months of the war. Their effectiveness elevated Turkey's global reputation as a military technology producer. Ankara now sees an opportunity to translate that military reputation into broader geopolitical influence. Turkey's ambitions go beyond mediation alone. Erdogan wants Ankara to play a central role in shaping the future security order of the Black Sea and Eastern Europe. This objective aligns with Turkey's long-term strategy of becoming an independent regional power capable of influencing events from the Mediterranean to the Caucasus. At the same time, Erdogan also sees opportunities inside Europe's growing internal crisis. Following recent elections in Germany and the rise of far-right parties across Europe, Turkish officials have argued that the European Union faces serious political fragmentation. Erdogan recently claimed that liberal democracy in Europe had entered a severe crisis and that Turkey could serve as a stabilizing force for the continent. Those remarks were controversial but carefully calculated. Ankara understands that Europe increasingly needs stronger military capabilities and more strategic partners. Turkey hopes to use this moment to improve relations with European countries while also increasing its influence within NATO. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan recently suggested that Europe's hesitation regarding Turkey's EU membership reflected broader uncertainty about how to integrate a powerful non-Western actor into the European system. Nevertheless, despite years of tensions with Brussels, Ankara appears eager to strengthen strategic cooperation with Europe on security matters. This is particularly important because the Ukraine war has exposed Europe's military weaknesses and dependence on external support. Turkey believes it can fill part of that gap while simultaneously advancing its own geopolitical interests. Ankara's support for Ukraine also reflects Turkey's long-standing concerns about Russian dominance in the Black Sea. A weakened or defeated Ukraine would significantly increase Moscow's regional influence and reduce Turkey's strategic room for maneuver. By helping Ukraine remain resilient, Ankara effectively limits Russia's ability to dominate the Black Sea region. And this explains why Turkey continues balancing cooperation and competition with Moscow at the same time. Turkey buys Russian gas and coordinates in Syria, yet also arms Ukraine and supports NATO initiatives. For Erdogan, this is not a contradiction, but a strategic necessity in a multipolar world. While Europe and the United States debated sanctions, packages, and aid strategies, Turkey consistently focused on maximizing its own regional influence. That strategy has made Ankara impossible to ignore in any serious discussion about ending the war. Many analysts now argue that excluding Turkey from future negotiations would be a major strategic mistake. Without Turkey, enforcing security arrangements in the Black Sea could become significantly more difficult. Turkey controls the critical maritime gateways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This gives Ankara enormous leverage over military and commercial access. Furthermore, Turkey's military capabilities provide practical value that many European countries currently lack. As discussions about peacekeeping forces continue, Ankara is carefully positioning itself as an indispensable actor. At the same time, Erdogan is also using the situation to strengthen Turkey's standing inside NATO. Trump's emphasis on burden sharing within the alliance aligns closely with Turkey's desire for greater recognition and influence. Ankara believes that its strategic contributions have often been underestimated by Western capitals. Now, with Europe facing war on its eastern frontier and uncertainty about long-term American commitments, Turkey sees an opportunity to reshape its relationship with the West. Still, enormous uncertainties remain. No final peace agreement exists between Russia and Ukraine. The battlefield situation continues changing, and both sides still believe they can improve their negotiating positions. Russia continues pursuing territorial gains, while Ukraine insists on preserving sovereignty and long-term security guarantees. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical competition between NATO and Russia remains unresolved. Any future peace arrangement would therefore require much more than a simple ceasefire. It would involve redesigning the security architecture of Eastern Europe and the Black Sea for decades to come. In that process, Turkey appears determined to ensure that it will not remain on the sidelines. Erdogan's willingness to discuss peacekeeping operations demonstrates how far Ankara is prepared to go in shaping the post-war order. Whether that strategy ultimately succeeds will depend on many factors, including Russia's calculations, America's long-term commitment, Europe's unity, and Ukraine's willingness to compromise. But one thing has become increasingly clear. Turkey is no longer acting merely as a mediator between East and West. It is positioning itself as one of the key powers that could determine how the war between Russia and Ukraine eventually ends and what kind of Europe emerges afterward.